participate at a working level at the planning office, so they're certainly informed about how we're moving forward and provide their views and input. So where did we go from that basic structure? Well, this is the diagram that we showed you at the beginning. So we said, okay, an advisory committee is a good idea. What are the other ways that we can provide people opportunities to engage and provide input to this initiative? So I'll talk about each one of these sort of bubbles on this diagram in turn. So to start with that Integrated Oceans Advisory Committee, or IOAC. This is described a bit in page 6 of the document that you have in front of you. The intention here is that this is, again, that inclusive body. It's intended to be seeking consensus around the recommendations that are coming out of this process. And it's going to bring together all of those different groups that you see listed there. We recognize that we need to find a balance between inclusivity on this committee while still finding a size that allows people to build relationships and work effectively and efficiently together as a group. So this is one of the questions that we have for you, is how does this group work effectively together? And just to sort of go back to what have we been hearing in these recent meetings, this has been a theme that comes up a lot. There's a recognition that, first of all, there are a lot of different interested parties who want to see themselves on this committee and ensure that they have a voice in this process. And they also recognize that there really does need to be a size that's workable here. So we can't necessarily have 100 people in the room. So one of the things that has come out of our meetings is this idea that perhaps there's a way to have input to PNCIMA that's focused on committees that are more geographically oriented to a portion of the study area. So that's something that we've been hearing a lot of. Examples of what this committee is intended to do, again, this is listed in the document, but just to give you a general sense very briefly, this is a committee who we expect would have a role in providing input to what are the goals and the objectives of this process, what are we trying to achieve, and what are the priority issues that we want to address in an integrated management plan. So in addition to that committee, if we think about the idea of priority issues, likely there's going to be some room in this process and a good reason to convene working groups that are a bit more focused on specific topics. So if we identify a particular marine activity as a topic or a priority issue, we may want to convene a working group around that and bring together a group of people who can do things like review and bring together the information that's available about that activity and its implications for other users and its implications for ecological values, etc. And that those working groups could also play a role in developing recommendations about addressing whatever issue it is related to that activity. Now, it could also be that we convene a working group around a specific area. So there's the potential here for, just to give you a few examples, a working group to do something that's very geographically oriented. And one example of that is, as many of you know, in the North Hecate Strait, there's a proposal for a wind farm there. Now, when that happens and if it does remains to be seen. But it happens to overlap with an area that's important for a crab fishery, which in turn happens to overlap with certain areas that are important for ferries traversing between Haida Gwaii and the North Coast. So can we convene a working group to discuss how those different uses might coexist and how we can keep them from, to the degree possible, stepping on each other's toes? So that's sort of a very geographically oriented kind of issue. And there may be other examples like that. We may also want to focus on a specific activity. So the example here is something like marine transportation. Given the potential for increases in certain traffic types on the North Coast, is there value in asking what are the implications of that for other user groups? What are the implications for coastal communities in terms of potential economic or social benefits, or what are the implications of drawbacks either for communities or ecological values, etc.? So these are a couple examples of working groups that could sort of take a piece of a larger management plan and develop some thinking around that in more detail. So sort of referring back to what have we been hearing, this is an idea that I think has found quite a bit of resonance among most of the communities that we visited. I think this sort of has made sense in that people see there's going to be priority issues for either their communities or given their interests. Another way that we intend to engage with people in the process is by taking advantage of processes that already exist. So there are all kinds of different places where people with a lot of expertise and experience in different areas or with certain marine activities are having conversations about how those activities are managed, etc. So what we envision here is that we don't want to duplicate those conversations, but we do want to take advantage of all of the knowledge that exists in those rooms, and also ensure that those rooms are informed of what we're doing in our process. So what this might look like is, as recommendations or proposals are coming out of the PNCIMA planning process, that we bring those out to, for example, the Sport Fishing Advisory Board, or a Commercial Fisheries Advisory Board, or a Marine Transportation Advisory Structure, and so on down the line, and invite their input and their feedback around that proposal and how it relates to their activity. And that we bring that feedback and input back into the planning process to inform how we move forward. So those are sort of three different kinds of, basically what amount to committees, right? You've got a working group, which is a kind of committee. You've got this IOAC, or Integrated Oceans Advisory Committee. And then you've got other kinds of advisory committees, etc., that already exist. So those are all ways that you can engage somewhat limited numbers of people in this planning process. Recognizing that we also want to provide opportunities for input from a broader public, we're also proposing that we create engagement mechanisms that would address that kind of need. So we're suggesting that there is likely a role for things like meetings and workshops in this process as well. And so one example of a kind of meeting would be like the forum that we had last year, where there was room for everyone to attend and provide some feedback and interact with one another over the 2 days, and also hear about what the plans were for this process. There may also be a role for things like workshops, where you take 1 to 2 days together with a larger audience than you could through something like a working group, and you develop some thinking, or you've learned more about a very specific topic that could inform something like a working group or some other component of the planning process. So one example of this, and some of you will be familiar with this because you were there, is we held a workshop in February in Prince Rupert, where we discussed some of the work that we're currently doing to summarize socioeconomic and cultural values within the PNCIMA area. That's going to be in a report. So at sort of the halfway point in the development of that report, we convened a workshop to make sure that we were gathering the right kind of information, that we were capturing the right kinds of trends with different marine activities or in different coastal communities within PNCIMA, and that we use that kind of information to inform how that report gets finalized. So these are sort of some different examples of how we can bring broader public kinds of feedback into the process. In addition to all of that, many of us are accessing a lot of information through the web. So this is another way that we envision we'll be engaging with people. And we've got a few ideas about what this might look like, including things like online meetings or forums or polls and surveys that allow opportunities for us to communicate out to a very large audience. It also allows opportunities for people to communicate back to us without having to do things like travel and incur the time and expenses that come along with that. What we've been hearing about this as a means of engaging is that we have to be very careful, especially with some of the local communities, or the smaller communities within PNCIMA, is that the web can't be the only way you try to communicate with those communities, given sometimes their limited access to the web or their limited familiarity with it. So that's another thing that we've sort of been hearing over the past 2 weeks in these community meetings, is we need to use this as one way of getting in touch with people, but certainly not the only way. I think all of you are aware that there is a website already where we host a lot of information about this initiative, and it's certainly a good way to stay sort of up to date about what's happening. We also have a listserv, and we'll send around a sheet for you to write your name down. I think many of you are already on that list, but if you're not,